I now invite the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, Mr. Kishore Singh, to report to the committee. You have the floor, Mr. Singh.
Madam Chairperson, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I have the honor to present my report to the United Nations General Assembly on a theme of very critical importance, the state responsibility of safeguarding the noble cause of education in face of its mercantilization and preserving education as a public good. Madam Chairperson, one witnesses explosive growth of privatization in education today. Taking advantage of limitations of the government capacities to cope with the rising demands on public education, privatization is making its intrusion at all levels of education. And the phenomena of education as an attractive business is assuming alarming proportions, unfortunately with very little control by public authorities. There is widespread concern with the negative impacts of privatization in scholarly writings, also with in civil society organizations, as well as in the work of international public organizations. And I was very pleased with the UNESCO Francophone study, which throws light on the publicity by which students are lured towards privatized schools without looking into the reality. As my report analyzes, privatization negatively affects right to education, both as entitlement and as empowerment. Moreover, it depletes public investment in education as an essential public service. Regulating private providers has become one of the key challenges for public policy today, as privatization is unfortunately supplanting public education instead of supplementing it. Madam Chairperson, Excellencies, access to education based on capacity to pay fee, which in many cases is exorbitant, flies into face of prohibited grounds of discrimination in international human rights conventions. These conventions prohibit discrimination based on social origin, economic condition, or property, of which private schools are glaring example, of this discriminatory practice. Education is not privilege of rich and well-to-do, it is an inalienable right of every child. The state is both the guarantor and the regulator of education, which is a fundamental human right and a public cause. Provision of basic education free of charge is not only a core obligation of the state, it is also a moral imperative. My report therefore lays stress on the need for regulating privatization, bearing in mind the principles and norms underpinning the right to education and the state responsibility under human rights law. Distinguished delegates, driven by business interests, privatization by definition is detrimental to education as a public good, and it vitiates the humanistic mission of education. We must recognize the importance of preserving the social interest in education and uphold education as a public good. This is invaluable for fostering the humanistic values of education, for common well-being, and for pursuit of the ideals of humanity. States that have principal responsibility for the direct provision of education in most circumstances and development of system of schools at all levels according to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. The adverse effect of privatization in education must receive foremost consideration in public policies, bearing in mind the principles and norms underpinning right to education. The state has the responsibility to establish the standards and conditions and ensure that there is effective and transparent mechanisms of control. Abusive practices by private providers denote the failure of state responsibility to adequately monitor and regulate privatized education. This calls for strengthening human rights mechanisms to effectively address and sanction violation of right to education by private providers. I have accordingly offered a number of recommendations in my report. Madam Chairperson, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, guided by human rights law and inspired by general principle of social justice and equity, as well as by education as a public good, states should develop a regulatory framework to govern the private providers of education. This is essential to hold them accountable for their operations with rigorous scrutiny. Such a framework should be comprehensive so as to apply to private education providers at all levels from early childhood to basic education to higher education. States should also put an end to market-driven education reforms, for example, providing subsidies to private education or allowing low-cost private schools, which have been examined to be, in fact, faulting in any quality education. Similarly, they should put an end to provision of school vouchers, which have also been investigated by law courts and found not in conformity with state responsibility. If private sector has to be made a partner in development, then public policies should be put in place to safeguard social interest in education while encouraging corporate social responsibility. Schemes aimed at contributing to education by private sector. Principles of social justice and equity should be kept forefront in introducing any reforms in education. Abusive practices in education make it incumbent upon governments not to allow private schools or educational establishments to operate unless its credentials and standards are verified by designated public authorities. National authorities must address the complex challenges arising from abusive practices, including corruption in privatized education, especially, for example, with the teaching profession. National designated authorities should also undertake full-scale investigation of fraudulent practices, including tax evasions by private providers who reap profit in the name of education. Madam Chairperson, private providers in education are accountable to the state and to the public for their activities, as demonstrated by a very large number of decisions by law courts all over the world, as I have cited in my report. Public interest litigation should therefore be encouraged, and this will reinforce the justiciability of the right to education. I encourage civil society to be a strong voice against the commercialization of education and to be vigilant observers and reporters of abusive practices in education. It is also important to encourage and support research, events, and expert consultations on the adverse effect of privatization on the exercise and enjoyment of the right to education. I also believe that the parliamentarians have a very important role to play in stimulating public debate centered around, for example, fundamental principles of public good in education as a public good. Madam Chairperson, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, before concluding my statement, I would like to emphasize that education is a public good that serves a greater social purpose than that benefits all. In the context of post-2000 development agenda, it is important to ensure that states do not disinvest in public education by relying on private providers, but assume fully their responsibility for providing quality basic education for all. I also take this opportunity, Madam Chairperson, on the other hand, besides my report, I also take this opportunity to mention that pursuant to the General Assembly resolution in 2012 on education for democracy, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights addressed a questionnaire to states, but I am told that replies received were very, very few. I look forward to continuing engagement in promoting education for democracy as an essential objective of right to education, and to your collaboration in this regard also. Madam Chairperson, I look forward to the dialogue with the states and to continuing interaction and invaluable support with a view to upholding and fostering noble cause of education. Thank you very much.
I thank the Special Rapporteur on the right to education for his statement.